Hey, how you doing, guys? So this video came about from a conversation I was having with some friends from my home state of Sonora. And essentially we're talking about the DNA results of our ancestries, and we're talking about general studies about where our possible ancestors come from: Spain, France, Italy, etc. Or how many of the Native Americans we have. And essentially, if you see the map here of Mexico, this region, Noroeste, Antiplano, and Noroeste, this would be the north. Right, and then you got the center and the south, and there's been a lot of studies going on explaining on how the DNA studies show that there's a huge variety of genetic diversity in Mexico. And the north in general has more European blood. And once you start going south around this area is about a mixture, about 50-50. And once you got the southern areas, you might have more Native American blood in there. And we were pretty much just generally talking about that. And what was interesting too is that some regions tend to have a lot of more African blood. For example, this zona Veracruz had a lot of African immigrants there, so there tends to be a lot more African blood around this region. And the groups pretty much got merged through intermarriage to the locals. But also what's interesting about is that the north regions also has about 2% African ancestry too, which is associated with the Spaniards having had the Muslim invasion. So they got African blood there, obviously, and they brought that over once it migrated to regions. And one interesting part, and you will appreciate this more if you speak Spanish, is that the Spanish in Mexico, in the north region that I mentioned, is somewhat different. The accent is pretty different. The way they say the she is a lot more pronounced. It sounds more like SH in the north, as opposed to CH, which is how you write in Spanish. But what's interesting is that a lot of the words in the northern region, which I thought that they were possibly Native American words that got introduced, which, for example, bichi means naked, and that's a Native American word that got introduced to the Spanish of the region, right? So there's a lot of words like this, but some words like carrilla, which is more like making fun of, in a playful way. Chamarra, which is your jacket. Chaparro, which means short. Arroyo, which is kind of like a river. Ama, mom. These words that I grew up with actually come from Spain, but they're not Spanish. So they come from a region called País Vasco, which is this particular region in Spain. And you can get this sort of map here of more or less the area that speaks it more. But it's a completely different language. And that's why we have those words. Essentially, people from this region colonized the north of Mexico. And that's what makes the Spanish so different. And to explain this too, which is, I've heard about this region for many years, and might have a relationship to that region, even though my DNA study did not specify that. That would be interesting to see if I could find out how much I'm related to this zone. But this zone is pretty interesting. As far as I know, the Vasco people, they speak obviously that different language, but their DNA is also different. And if you ever read the books of Conan the Barbarian, I don't believe they mention this in the movies. I haven't seen them all, the ones with Arnold Schwarzenegger. But Conan was an Atlantean. And the writer of those series, they have different characters, some that were from Atlantis, depending on the time period. They also have some time travel going on. They were from Atlantis, and the idea of Conan was one of the descendants of the Atlantis. So you have the Atlantis, which is kind of like a super Greek state that had the cataclysm, and the refugees of that area moved into Europe, and Conan was one of the descendants of those Atlanteans. So they had their own sort of culture and language, etc., going around that. So to a large degree, as far as I understand, that was inspired by the Vasco people, because they're a group of people where their language cannot be traced. So to explain that, you have to understand, and again, I might have some of these details wrong, but the way I understand it is that Europe during the Paleolithic age, so that's about 10,000 years up to, though downwards to about 2 million. So during the Paleolithic age, it got populated by groups of people that had, generally speaking, white skin, brown eyes, brown hair. And if you ever saw the TV show, read the series of George R.R. Martin, he explains that the first men, or the Starks, typically had these attributes. They had the brown eyes, brown hair, and white skin, right? And then you had the Lannisters, which were part of, I don't remember what they called them in the books, but they were an immigration, I believe started with an A, where they had the blonde eyes, the blonde hair and blue eyes. And those were later immigrants that fought the first men and kind of caused all the havoc with the Children of the Forest, if you ever saw that series. So those came in later, from later migrations, and essentially established the main culture from the area, which is inspired on real anthropological research. So if you look at the Irish people, you have some, or the UK, that have brown eyes and brown hair, and then you got some that might be blonde or have like red hair, like between the Celtics. So you have different group migrations coming from this area. So during the Neolithic age, between 9,000 and 3000 before Christ, these invasions happened mostly, as my understanding, right? So you got the people in northern India, which had the Sanskrit and created the Hindu religions, people in North Iraq and Iran, and people from this region actually also later on moved to Europe and brought agriculture, as far as I know. I mean, again, this type of research is going to have different people saying different things. So maybe my version, based on what I read, is going to be different than yours. But as far as I understand, that's more or less what happened. So once you got these groups combined, for most of Europe, it's kind of like a mixture of this. So for example, if I remember correctly my numbers, about 80% of the Y chromosomes in Europe come from the agricultural people from this region right here, Iraq and Iran, that migrated during the Neolithic age into Europe and essentially just started overbreeding the hunters and gatherers, which essentially disappeared. So Europe is a combination of these people. So if you go up north between Sweden, Germany, these populations tend to have a lot more of the original hunter-gatherer groups that I believe came from this region primarily, and the rest of Europe is kind of a mixture, right? So that makes sense. So there's pretty much about 3 groups that went there intermixed. The original population from the Paleolithic, migrations from around Russia, and eventually you have some people here that developed independently from Iraq, Iran, and had agriculture move in. So it's a mixture. And what's interesting about that is that from Europe, you can trace the languages. So it's what's called an Indo-European language, right? So you can usually trace the Germanic languages, which is Germany, Sweden, Holland, English, right? So these are Germanic languages. Or you can have like the Romantic languages, Italy, Spain, France, right? You get the idea. You can trace the origins, and a lot of these languages can even be traced back further to Russia around the Caucasus regions, and you have words like father, brother that are similar. You can trace back how there was a common ancestor to all this. But the Vasco people, as far as I understand, it's not related to any of these languages. So, as far as I understand, and again, this is something I sort of have dipped my toes on. I haven't really like read some research on it. But as far as I understand, which I found is really interesting, because these might be in part my ancestors, because I'm from that Sonora region. So as far as I understand, that the Vasco people might have been a leftover from the Paleolithic age. So what I mean by that is that you have the migrations from here, in the European migrations, that expanded over. and intermixed with the original people, or the later on the agriculture people that came in, which about 80% of Europeans have that Y chromosome from them. The Vasco people might have been a leftover that did not mingle with these migrations. So the more or less the original Paleolithic age that mixed everywhere else with these migrations. Another argument I heard, which I'm not sure if I entirely believe this one, but I think it's possible, is that they were possibly an island, which again comes to the Atlantis argument that that Robert guy who wrote the Conan the Barbarian books made. Not saying that Atlantis exists, it's just some story the Egyptians told Plato, so I don't know how damn realistic it is, but essentially the idea is that they came from an island and they developed independently in that island or some region, and it could be a region that got populated by someone else, right? So they were isolated somehow and went to that region and kind of lived independently. But that's not entirely absurd, I believe. It might be possible, even though I cannot explain how the hell this steps happen, which is, as far as I read, is just one of the possibilities. No one knows exactly how the hell this happened. But you have these Canarian Islands, for example, right? So these Canarian Islands are owned by Spain, but they're essentially in Europe. And the natives here, as far as I understand, look European or Caucasian, or not sure what the American term is for this exactly. Your guys' language is, you're using new proper words every time I go back to the US or something different. But essentially they look like Europeans, right? And genetically, as far as I read, they're closer to the Cro-Magnons that eventually expanded into Europe and North Africa, etc. Than any other population. So they do the DNA studies in Cro-Magnons. These ones are genetically closer, right? So essentially they went to the island, they look like this, and they live independently. And they have their own language, etc. And they're totally different, but they look European. So this might be an example of how the Vasco people originated. Just some separate group that originated in deep prehistory. We just have no way to trace where the hell it came from. Similar to it, you got the natives of Morocco, the Berber people, which, if I understand this correctly, they look like the picture right here, which they look very European, like white skin. And the Phoenicians, as far as I understand, kind of look like this. So they had a white skin, usually dark hair, kind of like the Greeks, but they also had these phenotypes, like with recessive genes, like some blonde and blue eyes. Like the Egyptians had a lot of blue eyed people and redhead people. Apparently in the U.S., this is not very well known, talking to people, but you had a lot of statues that had blue eyes. The Egyptian religion accounted for different hair colors. For example, you were dark hair, blonde, or redhead. I don't remember the details, but they associated a specific god that might have been your far ancestor, if my memory serves. But they did have some kind of categorization explanation for people's different hair colors. Like I said, black, blonde, and red. So the idea might be that these the Berber people, for example, live as a minority because you got the Arab invasions and people from other places. Eventually, the original natives from the areas, as far as I understand, became a minority inside the area they originally occupied, and the same might have happened with the Vasco people, but essentially it was with Europeans. But they kind of retained themselves in a little bubble, or might have originated from somewhere else and moved there, or were always there and yes, did not integrate with the rest. So there might have been like some region around the area, like I said, this is Morocco, which is borders with Spain. So it might be something like that. So as far as I know, no one knows for sure, but that's pretty interesting. So essentially, if you are from the north of Mexico or have some ancestry from the area, and the states for this, if interested, is listed as both Baja Californias, north and south, which are these two right here. Chihuahua, Coahuila, Durango, Nuevo León, Sinaloa, Sonora, and Tamaulipas. So if you're a Mexican American and might have some parents from that area, you might have some distant ancestors from the Vasco region. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. It came out to be a lot longer than I expected. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed. That's pretty much why Northern Mexicans speak slightly different than the rest of the world.